how do you actually predict the future of global power? Well, we're definitely not using a crystal ball today. Instead, we're taking an economic blood test. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're exploring the really fascinating research of Ray Dalio. He proposes that if we just treat the global economy like a machine, we can look at objective health indicators, kind of like how a doctor looks at your cholesterol or genetics, to reliably predict the rise and fall of nations over the next 10 years.
Okay, let's dive right into this diagnostic process. On the agenda for today, we'll unpack the core health formula, break down the productivity engine, and look at the scuba tank of debt. Then we'll examine the crucial role of culture before finally revealing the global prognosis for the next decade.
Starting right off with Section 1, the economic health formula. We are going to treat the global economy strictly as a top-down machine using a universal blueprint that has accurately predicted growth over 10-year cycles. So if we step back from the daily noise of the markets for a second, a country's economic health and future growth are fundamentally driven by two main forces. About two-thirds of that growth, 67%, is driven by productivity, basically a country's ability to produce more by working harder or smarter. The remaining one-third is dictated by indebtedness, which is just where a country happens to sit in its debt cycle. And you can see here exactly how these two forces interact over time. Think of that straight, upward-sloping line as long-term productivity. It's the fundamental engine of human progress. But that wavy line oscillating around it, those are the debt cycles. Credit allows people to artificially consume way more than they produce in the short term, but eventually they have to consume less to pay it all back. So the wiggles are the debt, but the overarching trajectory is always productivity. Moving on to Section 2, the engine of productivity, which honestly just boils down to output per worker. Look, in a global economy, capital is smart. It simply moves to wherever it's treated best. The biggest driver of this is cost of production arbitrage. It's a fairly simple definition. Competitiveness is driven by what you get relative to what you pay in one country versus another. Businesses are basically asking, does this country's workforce offer the absolute best value? If a country has well-educated, relatively inexpensive workers who invest heavily in their future, well, that country will inevitably attract global demand and grow much, much faster. Now, what is truly fascinating to me is how accurately we can actually measure this. By looking at purely mechanical factors, like the cost of a quality-adjusted educated worker, average hours worked, and household savings rates, we can build a super reliable index. When they tested this across 20 countries over the last 70 years, these specific productivity indicators alone had a massive 71% correlation to predicting a country's future economic growth. That is a timeless formula. But raw numbers, working hours, and education costs, they aren't everything. That brings us to Section 3, the role of culture. This is where we start diagnosing the intangibles. Because how human beings actually behave matters deeply to this economic machine. The index literally measures 6 cultural behaviors to explain why countries with identical resources might drastically overperform or underperform. For instance, do individuals enjoy the rewards of their own hard work? That's self-sufficiency. Is the rule of law strong, or is corruption deterring investment? The research shows that countries like Singapore heavily overperform their potential because of incredibly strong rule of law, while countries like Russia heavily underperform because cultural factors like corruption just drag them down. Now, I want to make a really important note here regarding this concept of savoring versus achieving. We have to remember this is a totally impartial, value-neutral measurement. The data doesn't judge. Prioritizing long vacations and a relaxed lifestyle over working late isn't morally wrong. It simply yields a different, lower output from the economic machine. It's a cultural choice, and that choice just happens to have measurable macroeconomic consequences. All right, next up is Section 4, the scuba tank of debt. This acts as a sort of booster system for the economy. Dalio uses a fantastic metaphor for this. He says, think of debt growth that is faster than income growth as being like air in a scuba bottle. It's such a perfect analogy because it captures the illusion of debt so well. You can take a deep breath from the tank to artificially boost your spending, and you look incredibly prosperous for a while. But there's a limited amount of air. Eventually, you literally can't borrow anymore, and you have to return the air you took out. And, that creates a highly predictable cycle. First, borrowing lets a country spend above its income, which creates a massive boom. Second, the debt burden hits a ceiling where income simply cannot service it anymore. And third, the painful reversal begins, deleveraging, where spending has to aggressively drop to pay off old debts. This exact cycle dictates why countries with low debt and high income capacity are poised to surge over the next 10 years, while over-leveraged nations face a grinding, painful slowdown.
Okay, let's bring it all together in Section 5, Predicting the Next Decade. Time for the global prognosis. We are going to apply this exact mechanical formula, productivity, culture, and debt, to the real world.
When we contrast these two broad profiles, a massive, massive shift becomes super evident. On one side, you have emerging markets offering highly inexpensive labor, high investment rates, and a strong cultural drive toward achievement. On the other side, the developed world generally features very expensive labor, high debt burdens, and a cultural shift toward preferring leisure and savoring life. Because capital is always seeking the best value, we clearly see why global investment is shifting so rapidly from the West to the East.
Just look at the projected winners here. India is poised to be the absolute powerhouse of the next decade, with an estimated real growth rate between 7.2 and 9.2%. Why? Well, they have incredibly inexpensive labor, highly favorable demographics, and their working-age males average an astounding 36 hours of work per week. They're followed closely by Mexico, which is benefiting from low debt and hard workers, and then China, which just continues to dominate through high savings rates and immense commercial innovation. And this right here reveals a massive gap in output per worker between the booming East and the established West. India's growth per worker is projected at nearly 6%, and China's at 4.4%. Meanwhile, the United States sits around 1.5 to 1.6%. Now, the US definitely remains highly efficient and innovative, but its growth is naturally capped because its workforce is already very expensive, savings rates are low, and it carries a relatively high debt burden. It's simply harder to squeeze massive new efficiencies out of a system that is already fully priced. Conversely, if we look at the bottom of the global prognosis, well, the diagnosis is pretty harsh for peripheral Europe. Countries like France, Italy, and Greece are facing intense stagnation or even negative growth. And the formula shows exactly why. They suffer from shrinking, aging workforces, highly rigid labor laws, expensive workers, and very heavy debt burdens. Culturally, their systems heavily prioritize savoring life and leisure over self-sufficiency. Again, it is not a moral failure, but mechanically, it just means their economic engines are slowing down significantly. The economic machine is relentless, right? And it runs on simple, objective math: productivity, culture, and debt. So I'll leave you with this final thought to evaluate your own local economy. When you look around at your country's health metrics, your debt levels, your education costs, and your work ethic, are you striking the right balance between savoring life and economic achievement? Because every single cultural and financial choice we make today dictates the health of our machine tomorrow. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.